Well, hey, y'all, it's your good friend Zeke, and I'm here to talk to you today about the Southern colonies. Now, we've talked about the New England colonies, and we've talked a little bit about the Middle colonies, but the Southern colonies, it's me right here, you know that. Can you name all the Southern colonies? Let's start with the first one Maryland. Maryland. Second one, Virginia. Virginia. The third, easy enough, North Carolina. And then South Carolina, and there's one more, Georgia. It's named after King George. Named after King George. How about that? This area was mostly rural, and rural means farmland. It's farmland, not compared to urban. Urban is city life for the city slickers. Now, you've seen me before in the city where I had to dress up real fine. Well, I'm still dressed up fine, but I'm dressed more for rural living. That's what I like the best. Now, in a rural life, there was mostly in the South one or two large cities. One of the largest cities was Charlestown. And we're going to be talking about Charlestown. Okay, that was in South Carolina. Most people were of English descent, but we had Scottish and we had French and we had Irish that were there, Dutch. Some Dutch came there too. But the church that they had was mostly Anglican church. Not quite all Protestant, not quite all Catholic, kind of like mixed together there. Now, they were very religiously tolerant. Do you understand that? That word tolerance, tolerance means that we get along with everybody. All right. Not like New England colonies were, a little more like what the middle colonies were. And in the South, they just accepted you. Okay. They just accepted you. So they had life that was so nice down there and religiously tolerant of everybody. Now, there was a couple of different classes of people. Those people that owned a lot of acres of land, I'm talking thousands of acres, okay? They were the upper class. And the upper class, they had money, they had wealth, and they had power, okay? Those that owned a few hundred acres usually worked for those people that were in the upper class, or they had small farms and they were called the poor class. The poor class, because they didn't have as much. But can you still be happy? Sure, you can still be happy. Sure, you can always be happy. So, two different classes, a little bit of a class warfare going there. And those that were rich tended to be governors, tended to be heads of the counties, heads of the area there, even of the church. And they kind of ran things. Sound familiar? Yep. They always seem to do want to run things. You think they're getting their hands dirty? No, they're not getting their hands dirty on doing this. Now, farmers down there are going to grow three main crops. Three main crops: tobacco, rice, and indigo. Tobacco, rice, and indigo. Do you know what all three of those are? I think you do. But we're going to start talking about one, growing tobacco. Tobacco, especially in good old Virginia and Maryland. Maryland had that too. All right. They grew tobacco. Now, tobacco starts with all the way back to Christopher Columbus, that he discovered some tobacco. He saw the natives had tobacco when he came to the islands in the West Indies. And some of that tobacco even made its way up to where Jamestown was. And who was the man that mixed that tobacco with the Native American tobacco that we had here in Americas? That was John Rolfe. John Rolfe, if you can remember John Rolfe in Jamestown, right? And who did he marry? We call her Pocahontas. But she had to change her name to Rebecca, if you remember that. Rebecca. Okay. Now, uh, tobacco would become a very big commodity, and they started to grow it in all different places. Eventually, the Raj in India was growing tobacco. And when he connected with Virginia tobacco, it went global, y'all. It went global. It was every place. So tobacco industry was a big, big industry. Now we know what tobacco can do to you. We know what it does to the land. It destroys the land. And it can also destroy you too. So if you're using that tobacco right now, Zeke's going to tell you, don't do it. Just don't do it. I don't do it. I don't want that stuff in here. I got to save this here. I got to be alive to be able to tell you more stories. So if you're doing tobacco right now, throw it away. But in any case, they were making lots of money on it. And when this here American Revolution was coming, the American Revolution, y'all, American Revolution against guess who? These guys right here, right? These guys right here. This is the British flag. When the American Revolution came, the tobacco industry had to move itself to different colonies, to Africa, to Asia. It still continued, no matter what, it still continued. All right? So, tobacco grows in large plantations, especially along the Chesapeake Bay. Along the Chesapeake Bay. The Chesapeake Bay has a couple different rivers, like the James River, the York River, and the Potomac River that feed into the Chesapeake Bay. And the farmers use this. How would they use the Chesapeake Bay for tobacco? Because they need water. They need water. All right. As the tides in the ocean rise up, so does the tides in the Chesapeake Bay, and all that water in the rivers starts to rise up. Guess what? It waters all the plants, and it did water the plants. When the water went down, took it out away from the land, back to where it was supposed to be. Now, why does this water rise up and down so much? It has to do with the tides of the ocean. And what causes the tides of the ocean? Well, we're getting real scientific here. It has something to do with the moon, the moon, and something with the pull of gravity. Well, you'll have to maybe ask a science teacher a little bit more about that. Right now, I'm just worried about the history part, okay? So, the area in Virginia literally is called Tidewater, Virginia. Tidewater, Virginia, because of the rise of the tides. They haven't called that today. Tidewater, Virginia. Pretty smart on these people's part. Now, if you were a rich plantation owner, on thousands of them acres, you would build yourself a dock, a big dock. So these big galleon ships can come in from France, from Spain, from England, from wherever they might be, the West Indies, and get the product, buy the product of tobacco. You might even have one of your own ship, and that would save this. It all comes down to this. It all comes down to this, boys and girls. Money. All comes down to money. And they were making a lot of money. So this is where the tobacco industry really starts. Now, let's talk a little bit about this other product called rice. Rice. Now, rice has to grow in a very peculiar place in water. In water? Well, everything needs water. No, I'm talking about actually in the water, about 2 feet in. All right. So here's how it starts. In this place called Charlestown, remember I told you we talk about Charlestown, South Carolina, in 1685, a ship from Madagascar. Now, do y'all know where Madagascar is? Madagascar is over towards the continent of Africa, that area over there. Okay. I'd have to ask my cousin, and you'll be meeting my cousin pretty soon. It's Captain Thomas W. Patton O'Meara. He's a sailor. He's a sailor. He's been all over the world a number of times. He could tell you a little bit more about Madagascar. But in any case, here this ship was in a bad storm. It was busted up pretty bad. They came into Charlestown and they asked, "Can you help us? Can you fix our ship?" Well, I guess we could, they said. So they fixed the ship and they got the men all squared away. And the captain left some rice called golden seed rice. Golden seed because it was a golden color. They really didn't know what to do with it, but they planted it because it's marsh down there. It's marshy. It's got some uh, wetness in the soil. And nothing else was going to grow there, especially in the swamp and the waters. And sure enough, that rice started to grow. Now, they brought some slaves up from West Indies that knew how to grow this stuff, and they taught them how to grow that. So that's an important fact that these slaves had come up, African slaves came up from the West Indies, taught them how to grow this rice in this swampy area. They started growing so much, y'all, that they were selling 300, 300 tons a year. A year. There was so much of it, they didn't have enough ships to ship it all. Wow. They called it Carolina gold. It set the standard for rice in the world. Now, that says a lot. That says an awful lot. It set the standard for rice in the world. Now, it lasted a long time. The rice growing I'm talking about. The plantation owners didn't really want to be around where they were growing rice in the summertime because there was a lot of standing water. And when you have standing water, you got a lot of skeeters. And you can get malaria, you can get yellow fever, and who knows what other else you can get down there. So they started to build houses. And I'm not talking little tiny houses, I'm talking big houses, big mansions in the city of Charlestown. They called them townhouses because they were in town. And they would live there most of the time and then go out to the plantation when it got a little cooler out and the skeeters were kind of gone. Okay. So as the rice was growing and it went through all different phases, even during the revolution, that revolution again, they still were growing rice. You know what it finally met its demise was during that war of northern aggression. Some people call it the Civil War. Civil War happened, and the Yankees came down to the South. They destroyed everything, and the rice was destroyed along with a lot of other crops. But good news, it's back. It's still back. They're still growing rice down there. They're still growing rice, and it still is a very big crop. Now, there's another crop I want to talk to you about. And it's called indigo. Indigo. Isn't that a funny word? Indigo? In to go where? No, that's not what that means. Indigo is a beautiful purple flower. And you know what? I think I have a flower over here. I'm going to show you what it looks like. Okay, I have a flower here that looks an awful lot like the indigo. It grows on a plant. It grows on a plant, and they're flowers. And they squish the flowers and mix it with water and some other kind of chemicals, and they can make dye out of it, blue dye, blues and pinks and purples and some reds, where before they only had blacks and greens and browns and blech color. Now they got pretty colors. Look at this. Let me bring this real close to you. Can you see how pretty this is? Now this is the color of indigo. It's the color of indigo. Isn't that nice? So you can imagine the colors that they would get from that color of indigo, right? The English wanted this real bad. Now, don't forget, these colonies were owned by the British. They were owned by the British right here. All right. They had textile mills in England. They were the only ones that had it. They didn't have them here. No, they didn't have them here. They didn't. They wouldn't even tell anybody how to make it because they had a monopoly on it. And so they would take all the indigo and they would have this blue dye and they had all types of fabric that were dyed different colors. And then they would sell it back to the colonies at a price. Here we go, talking about money again, at a price. And it was very expensive. Now, the only other people that were really growing or really making something like that would be the Chinese, and you couldn't get in that place. You couldn't get in there. It was all walled off. So it was very, very tight to get in there. You remember talking about the Silk Road? Yes, you could get through that on the Silk Road, but it was so dangerous. Now England could make it themselves, and they could sell it to us. Isn't that something? It sure is. Now, for all these plantations, tobacco, rice, indigo, you need laborers. You need lots of laborers. There just wasn't enough people around that would be able to work. So they had indentured servants from Europe and from Africa. And so you had a lot of different people coming here as indentured servants, working anywhere from 5 to 7 years, and then they would move on and get their own land and do whatever else they had to do. And that could be a problem because, first of all, you had to pay for them to come over here. That costs money. Second of all, would they ever show up for work? Well, they better show up for work. If they're an indentured servant, they better show up for work because they're supposed to be there. They're like a slave, but they can be released. Third thing is, once they're released, you got to train a whole new bunch of people to do their job. Hmm. So eventually, from the West Indies, we would start getting slaves. Now, around 1650, 1680, we started having African slaves for life. For life, which is a shame. We should never have anybody as a slave for life. We should never have anybody as a slave, period. Right? We shouldn't. But hey, y'all, this is history. And this is from the 1600s. I'm not judging anybody for what they did then. I already know it's wrong. They didn't know it was wrong. Maybe they did know it was wrong, but it was. In any case, you did have people that were enslaved, and a lot of them were African. Most all of them were African. There were some Irish that came over here. Yeah, the Irish didn't come here, and they didn't work out too well. Native Americans, they tried keeping them as slaves. That didn't work out too well. The Africans, they took them by the boatloads coming from them castles on the west coast of Africa, built by the Portuguese. And now by the boatload, they were coming over here. You had slavers and you had slave traders. And they were making a lot of money on these people. In any case, these people that came over here, um, only a fraction of them would stay in America. A lot of them would go down to Brazil and down to South America, but that's immaterial. The main thing I want to talk about is having the slaves here and the impact that they made on the southern colonies. This was part of their economic system, is that they had slaves here. Now, they felt that they were really getting free labor. Is it really free? You have to pay for them to begin with. You have to keep them fed. You have to keep a roof over their head. You have to have 24/7 medical care in case someone got sick. And then what about retirement? You are the retirement. You are the retirement if you have these people. So they weren't saving no money and they were making these people miserable. They really were. Now, let me tell you a few things about this. There was a word for in between Africa and America. They used to call it the triangular trade route. Now they just call it the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage from Africa to America was called the Middle Passage, where they were bringing these four people over here. And it was just, they would try to destroy their traditions and destroy their heritage. Tell them, you have to be like us. You have to speak English. Forget that African name, forget the African language, and forget where you come from because you live here now and be like us and be Christians. To be Christians. Imagine that. They wanted them to be just like the English. Same thing the Spanish did to the Indians, the Incas, and the Aztecs hundreds of years before that. So, why is that? It's a conquering spirit. So, it kind of backfired on them a little bit because as the slaves became Christians and they learned about the Bible, they learned about one very important person, and that was Moses. You know, Moses was born a slave. So I'm giving you a little bit of a teaching here. Moses was born a slave, and when the king was killing all the babies from 2 years on down because they thought a king was coming out of one of those children, Moses was put in a basket and put on the river. And who do you think picked him up from the river? A princess, an Egyptian princess, who the Jews were enslaved to for over 400 years. Now, he grew up like a king. Well, prince anyway. He had everything he wanted. And then he found out one day he's a Jew. He was a slave. So he broke away from that and he went to the Jews and he told Pharaoh, I want my people to be released. Well, Pharaoh didn't want to do that. So you might know the rest of the story. They got released all right. He got them out. And Moses led these people out of Egypt. Slaves in the colonies are figuring the same thing. There will be somebody that will lead us out of the slavery. And eventually, y'all, it will happen. It will happen. But they kept that hope. They kept that hope. And that hope is what preserved them all those years. Now, on the plantation, there was a place called the Big House. And the Big House, well, that is where the master lived. All right. And some slaves did work in the Big House. So there was different occupations that they did. Okay. So they went from the Big House to working in the stables, to maybe working making nails, to the leather shop, to eventually out in the fields. There was always something that they had to do. Okay, so were they ever set free? It's a possibility. There were some that were set free. Okay, if their masters were dying or knew they were going to die and they had nobody else to take them, they would give them their papers, set them free. There was a couple that I know of personally that were set free. Eventually, they got land themselves and they accumulated some wealth. Now, some of them became carpenters and tailors and sailors and things like that, but some became plantation owners and had slaves themselves. Now, that just doesn't seem right. It's all about this. Again, it's about this. All right. So there were some Africans that became free, free men and women, had plantations, and eventually would have slaves themselves. That's a known fact. Well, I guess you just can't fix some things, can you? In any case, uh, there were also some people that went north and some that went west. And west is over what mountains? The Appalachian Mountains. This would be a whole new series to talk about. Just going over those Appalachian Mountains because it's scary. Who's over the other side of the Appalachian Mountains? Well, there's a lot of Native Americans over there, and sometimes they don't like anybody in their land. Most of the time, they don't like anybody in their land. Now, just let me have you a little essential facts here. Okay, now we've gone through all the colonies a little bit. Georgia, of course, was set up by a man named General Oglethorpe, and he asked the king for a charter. And when the king gave him a charter, he knew that Georgia would be the buffer between Spanish Florida and the colony of South Carolina in case there was ever a war. There never was a war. So let's talk about this. First of all, plantations were a prominent feature in the southern colonies. They focused on growing crops, and we know what three crops they were. Remember again, tobacco, rice, and indigo. Okay. Slavery played a very significant role in the southern colonies with a large population of enslaved Africans working on the plantation. There was. Virginia is the first permanent English colony in North America and was founded in 1607, Jamestown. And they didn't have a very good, easy route to get there, right? They landed on that peninsula there, and there was all kind of skeeters there, and the water wasn't good there. And they met with the Powhatan tribes there, and they went through some rough times. Remember the starving time? We talked about the starving time before. It just wasn't good, folks. It really wasn't good. In any case, Maryland was established in 1633 by Cecil Calvert, also known as Lord Baltimore II. His father was the first Lord Baltimore, and now Cecil, his son, is the second Lord Baltimore. And they were a refuge for Catholics, Catholics coming from England, okay, seeking religious freedom. So that's the reason they came over here. Remember the two ships they sent, the Ark and the Dove, the Ark and the Dove. But it wasn't just all Catholics. There were some Protestants that came with them. And eventually they would have a little bit of problem, okay, where Lord Baltimore would have to come up with what he called the Toleration Act. And the Toleration Act would say that all Christians can worship as they please, as they please. So if you want to be Catholic, that's okay. You want to be Protestant, that's okay. That was all right. Toleration Act. Now, North and South Carolina were originally a single colony, one just called Carolina, the Latin form of Charles, called Carolina. And it later became separate royal colonies. Now, you know what a royal colony is? The king owns it. The king likes to own everything because he's the king. Why not? Why shouldn't he own everything? You do all the work, and then I'll come, he says, and take it over. That's a royal colony. Now, Georgia was founded in 1732, of course, by General Oglethorpe, and eventually it would be taken as a royal colony too. Agricultural, particularly farmers and plantations, was a primary occupation because it was rural down there. So we're covering this again. It's called rural down there. Uh, Southern colonies were very warm, long growing season, very good land down there. Um, Religious diversity, Southern colonies, Anglican, Baptist. If you were wanted to be Catholic in Maryland, you can be Catholic. There were Jewish people that lived there too. Not too many Quakers moved down there. Quakers are more in the middle colonies in Pennsylvania. Remember William Penn, right? So they were very tolerant of that. Now they used these crops down there called cash crops. It meant that they sold them for money, just like the middle colonies, but even a more abundance than the middle colonies did. So they were making lots of money on these cash crops. That's the way you have to farm. If you're going to farm, you might as well go big or go home. Now, let me tell you about these charters, just so we can kind of get this straight. I don't want to be all over the place, but this is how it starts off. There were three different types of colonies in the British North America: royal colonies, proprietary colonies, and corporate, which means they were set up by a company. Okay? Each colony was granted a charter, usually from the English king. Could be one of the kings, could be Charles, could be James, could even be George. Okay? A royal uh, charter meant that the king would be in charge of it. Now, the king would give you a charter in a specific area, and once the people there made a go of it, he eventually would come in and make it a royal colony, and it would be run by him, and he would put a royal governor there. You still have the House of Burgess, but the royal governor had the last word. All right, royal colonies under the crown were all controlled. By 1775, all of the colonies, all 13 of them, were run by the king. Run by the king. So he waited from 1607 to 1775. He owned them all. He owned them all. Now, a corporate or joint stock charter was granted to businesses. Like colonies with a corporate charter are usually referred to as charter colonies. All right, Virginia was founded as a charter colony and became a royal colony in 1625. A proprietary colony meant that somebody owned it. This territory was granted usually to a person or a family, and also granted them rights to the colony. North Carolina, South Carolina, granted to businesses, rich people, and they were friends of the king. Um, New York was a proprietary colony, and later on, he had split off from that. New York, James, the Duke of York, owned New York, and eventually he would give some of that land, New Jersey, to two of his friends, and eventually that became a royal colony because they just didn't know what they were doing there. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit more about the slavery as it comes along. Okay, during the 1650s, over 100,000 Irish children, generally from 10 to 14 years old, were taken from their parents and sold as slaves in the West Indies, Virginia, and New England. Now, I don't know if you ever heard that before, but in fact, more Irish were sold as slaves to the American colonies from 1651 to 1660 than the total existing free population of the Americas. There was an awful lot that were sold. Families were broken up, a lot taken down to the islands. Few people realize from 1600 to 1699, I'm looking at my dates here, more Irish were sold as slaves than Africans. 1600 to 1699, almost 100 years. More were sold. Wow. Finally, in 1839 now, y'all, 1839, a bill was passed in England forbidding these activities of selling Irish and taking their land and splitting up their families and bringing the Irish slave trade to an end. Now, the institution of slavery in Africa, that's terrible. That was terrible too, because these 32 castles that were built by the Portuguese housed everything from spices to rum to ammunition to black powder, to slaves, to slaves. And a lot of times these African kings would fight each other, and the losers would end up at the castles. And they would sell these people, split up families, and split up whole communities, not knowing where they were going. By the 1640s, however, practices of enslaving Africans for life and servitude had been established in Virginia, 1640s, 1650s. It started off slow, but before you knew it, it became rampant. In other words, a lot at one time. The increased importation of tobacco by the English, that's one of the big sellers, as their appetite for uh, this tobacco soared. It facilitated the rise of a large scale tobacco plantation system in Virginia. By 1690, most of Virginia's slaves were being imported directly from Africa, not the West Indies now, directly from Africa. So instead of just doing the triangular trade route, it was the middle. It was the middle uh, trade that was coming over here, right? Wasn't good. Wasn't good at all. All right. With the introduction and legalization of slavery in 1750, Georgia started to import slaves. A system of bondage became common to all 13 colonies now. All 13 colonies. Now, Africans were owned by the English and also by the natives. And the natives owned natives, the Africans owned Africans. I mean, slavery was rampant in any color, in any color. So I want you to understand this, that it is a control thing. Slavery is a control thing. And it's not good, no matter what color you are, to be enslaved by anyone. So that brings me to my final point. 32 minutes already. There was something in the South that they called slave codes. Slave codes. So write this down, slave codes. They were laws that denied slaves most of their rights. Most of their rights. They were property. People were property. Just like you buy anything else, they were property. Some could not carry weapons, they could not hold meetings, and in most cases it was against the law to teach them to read or write. So let's take a look at that. Why do you think they would want them not to carry weapons? Well, they might shoot the masters. But who do you think did all the hunting? Pretty much they did. So they had weapons at all times. They had different weapons, not just guns, knives, and things that they used. They just didn't kill anybody. So, second thing, they could not hold meetings. Why? That way they would plan on how they would escape. Now, if they would escape, where would they go? Over those mountains? The Appalachian Mountains? Possibility. But then they would send people after them, and then it would get rough. So that's why they couldn't hold meetings. They were also, a lot of times, there was laws they could not learn to read or write. Read or write. If they learned to read, then they could find out things that were happening and things that were going on. And they could also start reading the Bible. Some did learn to read, and they did learn to write. And some of these people, even like Martha Washington and Thomas Jefferson, on their plantations, they did learn to read and write. They did. They did learn to read and write. So Thomas Jefferson said this about slavery. It's very interesting. He said, "We have the wolf by the ears. We can either hold him or safely let him go." Understand that. We have the wolf by the ears. We can neither hold him by those ears and we cannot safely let him go. How is this going to end? We'll learn about this. We'll learn about this. And slavery will be done. Great day that was. Slavery was done. You know, old Zeke never had no slaves, never wanted no slaves. I have enough trouble with myself. So I hope you understand some things here today, talking about the southern colonies. They're a nice place to be. With all this that we've talked about, I always like to end with this. Be kind to somebody today. If you know somebody that you love, tell them that you love them. And tell them today. Go up and give them a big hug, okay? Tell them that you love them and you care about them. It's important. It's important. Don't be mean to nobody and don't be hateful. That doesn't help anybody. We have enough of that in the world. What we need more now is people that care for each other and that love each other and respect each other. It's a big thing. So next time we get back together, we'll be talking about something else. I'm not quite sure right now, but I'll see you next time. Bye, y'all.